blessing to see everything come full circle. So without further ado, let's jump right in, family. And I do not say family lightly, because on the journey in which we are going on a journey of discomfort. We are going on a journey of accountability. So this is interesting conversation at the dinner table. And I am inviting you, family, to hold each other accountable along this journey. So today we're talking about the marginal cost and exploration of Black queer grief. Now, to give you a little background on who I am, because I know y'all like, who's this joker? We don't know this man. Like, how do we know that we need to be listening to whatever he's saying? So I am a licensed master social worker in the state of Alabama. I'm a two-time graduate of Alabama A&M University, go Bulldogs, where I studied social work on both the bachelor and master's level. And during my master's, concentrated in community mental health. I've served as a behavioral health workforce training program fellow. I've done various workshops on the intersection of art and mental health. And my heart among hearts as it relates to research interests, to practice interests, all relate to minority mental health, grief, and LGBTQIA plus advocacy. I know y'all probably would have never guessed that, right, by the topic, just none of those interests. And I currently serve as a senior case advocate for a protection and advocacy organization for individuals with disabilities. So during this presentation, feel free, if there are any questions you have as it relates directly to this topic, whether it be my work in protection and advocacy, I'm open to all questions. So as we start this presentation, I think it is, so critical that I start with the why, right? I don't just want to inundate you with experience or inundate you with theory, but I think it is critical that we start with the why. And for me, it's passion. A couple months ago, for the first time, I heard this sermon by Sarah Jakes Roberts, and she talked about passion, and she broke it down to its Latin roots and defined it as to suffer. And she said that when you have something that you're passionate about, if it's truly your passion, it's something that you're willing to suffer for. And a lot of times, I think when we come into spaces where we specifically talk about queer rights and queer issues, a lot of times you have people on the outside who say, it's not that deep. I know you're kind of describing, some of the discrimination, some of the hurdles that you face, but it's not that problematic, right? But the reality is that when you step out and you're doing this work, and this work doesn't simply apply to doing presentations, this work is simply being who you are, whether disclosed or non-disclosed. And there is a responsibility that comes with that work, and there is consequence that comes with that work. But for me, I am so glad to be able to be in this position, to be able to share information on things that are passionate to me, because I am willing to suffer. When I think about little queer closeted Josh and the resources that would have helped him, I'm willing to suffer because I know that there is another Josh out there that also needs those same resources, that same help. So passion for me is the ultimate provocation. And then when it comes to minority mental health, when it comes to grief healing work, when it comes to LGBTQIA plus advocacy, these are all passions because these are all things I'm willing to suffer for in order to make sure that I get my people what we need. All right, so as we kind of delve into some of the topic matter, it will be a blended approach of experiential and academic. So the cool thing about being at the center of what I'm talking about is that I've lived and continue to live what I'm talking about, but I also have the theoretical framework with formal education to kind of fill in the gaps of some of that. All right, so what are our objectives? So we do want to differentiate between acute, integrated, and complicated grief. We want to identify how stages of grief operate cyclically, which I know that most of us on the call in a mental health setting obviously probably already know that, but how it operates cyclically specifically in a Black queer context. I also want to explore how disclosure and non-disclosure can produce and exacerbate trauma. I think a lot of times we get a diluted version of disclosure, and we often see it in like the Hallmark movie kind of way, where somebody gets to feel just impassioned and empowered, and like everything is sparkles and sashaying away. But in reality, disclosure can bring a lot of hurdles as well that don't just always feel warm and fuzzy and liberating. We also want to examine compounding effects of interacting oppressive systems. Once again, for the, it's not that deep crowd, it isn't until you see it on paper and you see it tangibly that you understand how systemic oppression really does work and how those barriers are derivative of those systems. And finally, we want to observe privilege and proximity to intersectional marginalization. Josh, what does that mean? Simply put, just because you are marginalized does not mean that you do not have privilege. And just like I said at the beginning of this, family, we want to be sure that we are holding ourselves accountable. So that means even within spaces where the majority of the call, if not all of the call, have marginalized identities, let's still reconcile that there is power that we do have, that there are instances we either look away or we do something about it. We step up and become proactive. All right, so a couple months ago, I wrote this piece and I actually recently had it published, entitled The Miseducation of Black Queer Southern Youth. And I think this paragraph is a great excerpt to kind of get our minds in the place for where we're going. So to be queer is to be an honorary outcast almost anywhere. To be Black and queer is to be unsafe among your own kin. To be Black and queer in Southern is to sleep with a knife beneath your pillow because the safety of home has always been transitory. It is a heavy task for queer folks to prioritize education when survival is an inescapable concern. And for me, the two things I want us to pull from this are kin and survival. A lot of what we're talking about, I've already tapped you in as my extended family for the next hour or so, but also understanding that when we talk about Black queer grief and when we explore what is lost in Black queerness, we understand that a lot of it relates to connection, familial connection, cultural connection, societal connection. And we know how critical social support is to individual success. And to that second point, the other word we want to focus on is survival, especially in the face of the it's not that deep crowd. Because for a lot of Black queer individuals, it isn't just a matter of, do I just want to be educated and live the best life I possibly can? But more often than not, the consideration is, how can I remain safe? How can I remain protected? What avenues of recourse do I have in the face of danger? And as we think about that concept of family and of survival, I would be remiss if we did not, enter into submission Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because we know that at the bottom is what? Our physiological needs, the things your body literally cannot do without. If you're not getting food, if you're not getting water, if you are not getting sleep, you are going to physically perish. And that's before we get to the warm, fuzzy feelings of like love and belonging. But even as we look at the hierarchy, we look at safety and security needs, we look at love and belonging. And when we think about Black queerness and about so much of what is lost in the face of whether it be disclosure or even internally knowing who you are and not disclosing, so two of the things that take the greatest hit are your safety and security needs, once again, in relation to that sense of protection, and love and belonging. Where can I go? Oftentimes within the queer community, we talk about the idea of a chosen family. And I once told someone, I said, a chosen family is beautiful, but nobody really flocks to your chosen family if your actual biological family provided the support that was necessary. Chosen families are beautiful, but they're often alternatives. So, where there is grief, there is loss, right? And I always like to kind of break this down because grief has been a central part of my life for a couple years now. To give context, during my sophomore year of college, my mom passed away. And as I was trying to make sense of it, as I was trying to process what was going on, one of my biggest concerns was, how can I take this pain and how can I turn it into something practical? How can I make it something that more people can, feed from, that we don't just have to look at this as a loss, but we can convert this into something powerful and productive. And during my undergraduate tenure, I started the 100 Place Project on my campus, which was a grief support initiative. And one of the biggest things that was really empowering during that time was that I emphasized the fact that grief does not just relate to physical death, because sometimes that will happen. And when you're in spaces where you're talking about grief, it's easy to get in the oppression Olympics where somebody says they had a physical death. So you might not feel comfortable talking about your divorce, or you might not feel comfortable talking about the fact that your best friend of 20 years is no longer your best friend and your world feels completely different. So in understanding that grief applies to all loss, we get to reclaim our power in that sense. So where there is grief, if we're talking about Black queer grief, what is our loss? So here we have two identities that I want to break down, right? We have Blackness and we have queerness. Now, in terms of Blackness, the biggest hit that I see oftentimes where the loss is in our cultural connection and our cultural protection. And I'm sure you've heard conversations many a times where we will hold maybe movements accountable, such as Black Lives Matter, where we ask the question, if Black Lives Matter, is that applicable to all lives within that umbrella? Or is it straight cis het Black lives, right? So we do understand that oftentimes in disclosure, we do not feel safe among our own community as it relates to a cultural and racial community, going back to that idea of kin, feeling unsafe with your own kin. And then when we look at queerness, we are looking at the things we lost in terms of heteronormative assimilation. So some people, whether they're disclosed or non-disclosed, have this great ability to do what we call passing, right? You can't tell if they didn't say anything, you would have never known. But then for some people, it's also harder to pass because of the societal ideas that we have around feminine and masculine expression. But when you are on the record, disclosed as queer in any setting, that privilege and power that you had in heteronormative assimilation goes away. And that certainly is not only a loss in terms of the consequence of opportunity, but it's a loss in the sense of the life that you might have projected for yourself. Because we know how societal norms work, right? You know, we want the white picket fence, we want the wife or the husband, however you envisioned it at the time. You know, you want the dog, you want the cute kids. You have this idea of what life is and how smoothly it will operate if you can assimilate into that heteronormativity. But once you reconcile your Black queerness, you understand that these are two losses that you have to take on. All right, so where does this title even come from? So I'll admit it, I'm a self-admitted nerd. I love to learn something, whether it be in science, whether it be in another discipline, and find a way to apply it to things that I'm very passionate about in my practice and in my own personal life. So in undergrad, I was taking an economics course, and on the first day of class, the professor walked in and she said, if you don't remember anything else, I want you to remember these three things. I want you to remember, one, that everything has an opportunity cost. Two, there is no such thing as a free lunch. And three, your marginal benefit should outweigh your marginal cost. So let's unpack one. What is an opportunity cost? An opportunity cost is the next best thing you pass up for whatever you chose. So say for instance, you're in college, you know it's this bomb party going on, but you also know you need to study for this test. I have a decision to make. So if I study for that test, that is my choice, and my opportunity cost is going to that party. What will be the consequence? You know, hopefully I do really well on that test, but at the same time, you know, when you're in college, everything feels like the best thing. So every party is the best party after and after and after. So if I didn't miss that party, I missed out on the chance of a lifetime. But vice versa, if we choose the party as our main choice, the opportunity cost was our time to study. What happens? We might not do so well on that test. So for every choice that we make, there is a choice foregone. Two, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Simply put, nothing in this world is free. Even if you did not pay the price, nothing in this life is free. Somebody, you know, took you out for lunch. It was great. There was no cost to you that you could see. The resources came from somewhere. Somebody had to cook it, and whoever was cooking it got paid. You know, nothing in this world is free. Everything comes with a cost. And finally, your marginal benefit should outweigh your marginal cost. Marginal cost, the title of this entire presentation. And what that essentially states is that for the extra you spend, the extra benefit you get should outweigh whatever you spent. So I don't know if a lot of y'all are loving cheese like me. I just love cheese. I'll put cheese on anything, right? So when I go to Burger King and I get my Impossible Whopper and I decide to add cheese, that extra 60 cents, I have to do a little reconciliation. You know, do I want to add that 60-cent slice of cheese? Is the benefit of my experience going to be so good that that extra 60 cents I spent, will it feel worth it, right? So here I've given some anecdotal, instances with which this operates, but here's how it directly relates to Black queerness. So everything has an opportunity cost. When you decide to disclose your queerness, there is something that you are giving up in that place, whether it be privacy, whether it be protecting yourself more from possible discrimination and attack, whether it be very real professional implications, such as academic opportunities, employment opportunities. There are buku opportunities that are foregone when you are on the record as queer. And interestingly enough, there are going to be instances where it's covert, and when you very clearly know that it has happened, or it's going to be experiences like I have actually encountered where opportunities didn't come through. And I found out, a year later, somebody talking to me very casually, assuming that I already knew what happened. And they were like, yeah, it wasn't going to be a good look. They weren't really rocking with you. And I said, what are you talking about? Right. And in that moment, there is even like a second death of realizing, and at that time I wasn't even out. So it's just interesting how many different things that you're passing up when you choose to prioritize self as it relates to disclosure. Second, there is no such thing as a free lunch. I love the opportunity to be able to share space with you all, to talk about something I'm extremely passionate about, and to hopefully change lives, to hopefully enter into evidence, something that I can put on your mind that you will take with you, that has the power to shift and transform your worldview. But even me being here right now, sharing this information is not free. In 1930, I would not necessarily have been giving this presentation. 1835, I would not necessarily have been giving this presentation. But there are my queer ancestors who laid the groundwork, who even in 2021, for us to still have progress, but still have a long way to go. There are so many people who have laid the groundwork. So even me being able to operate in this space and to speak about what I'm passionate about did not come freely. And finally, the marginal benefit should outweigh your marginal cost. And this is such an important conversation that I think is often had intracommunally within the queer community, because one of the questions that you have to ask yourself is disclosure worth it? Everybody is not going to answer that the same way. And as someone who is disclosed and who understands the ramifications of disclosure, I will never make anyone feel bad for not choosing disclosure, because I understand, and I often say that queer disclosure is a political decision. Because there are so many things that you stand to lose, you have to be really, really intentional in evaluating if that is a decision that you're willing to make, especially when we think in the context of a heteronormative society in which we have always been compelled to disclose who we are, while our straight counterparts do not. There are no heterosexual announcements, right? Nobody has to walk into the room and say, hey, just in case you guys wanted to know, I'm straight, right? That's how heteronormativity operates. That is the general assumption. But for queerness, even in us having to feel compelled to disclose by society, we have to other ourselves as the world continues to other us. All right, so what does grief like? I think that's very important as we unpack specifically what Black queer grief looks like. So during my MSW practicum, I was in a clinical setting, had the opportunity to co-facilitate and facilitate individual counseling sessions, one of the most rewarding experiences of both my academic and personal life. And one day, grief came up, and the beautiful thing about us being in a helping profession, we know that learning never stops. You're constantly delving into new resources, constantly learning new things. And one day, in preparation for a session, as I was doing some grief research, I found grief broken down into this way. So we start with acute grief. Acute grief is the sharpest pain grief. It's the initial wound, right? It's when the emotion might feel the intensest is when the loss has just occurred. It's the freshest the pain feels. Now, what happens is over time, though the pain of the loss does not dissipate completely, we get to a place of what we call integrated grief, which is like the healed wound, right? So it's like you see the scar, you remember what happened, but it's certainly not as painful as that initial wound. But sometimes along the way, that wound gets infected. And when that wound gets infected, we have what's called complicated grief. So as we break down Black queer grief and we think about some of the losses that exist within an experience, what happens is, as can happen with all levels of grief, right when you think you're healing, something else is thrown in the pot to compound it. Something else is thrown into the pot to compound it. So just as you think you're getting to a new place of new health and new wealth and protection, there are a lot of things systemically and interpersonally that can complicate the extent to which you are able to heal. And instead of that wound healing and you just having a scar that you can look back and think on, it's an infected wound in which other precautions have to be taken. All right, so the Kubler-Ross model, I'm sure, is not unfamiliar to many of us, but it offers us great context for grief in terms of stages. And once again, we want to unpack the fact that grief is not linear. It's not point A to point B, so it's not denial and you do all of this and you get to acceptance and you're good. Like you've done your work and you're done. Sometimes you can get all the way to acceptance and the grief hits you on a random day and you're all the way back at anger, or you find yourself slipping back into depression. And that's okay because you're human. But what I think is so beautiful about human beings is that we have access to knowledge. We have access to resources that allow us to be self-aware and to not always be able to immediately fix what's going on with us internally, but we do have the opportunity to at least be self-aware and start to strategize for what we need. So when we look at the Kubler-Ross model of grief, we know that we talk about stage 1 being denial, talk about stage 2 being anger, stage 3 being bargaining, stage 4 being depression, and that final phase that we know sometimes can ebb and flow is acceptance. And it's important to understand these because I know in my personal grief, one of the biggest things that I knew set me back a lot was I was misnaming where I was in my journey. So when I lost my mom, there was so much of that experience that I was so convinced that, wow, I'm just depressed. I'm just depressed. I'm just depressed. And I got to a point where I realized a lot of what I was calling depression was actually anger. And when you are not sure, or if you're confused on what stage you're actually in or what emotion you're actually feeling, you're going to be trying to use the wrong tools to fix the wrong problem. So I was looking for the tools that was going to help the depression when really I needed to console my anger, my bitterness, right? So being able to name that emotion, being able to name that stage equips us to be able to give ourselves what we need. All right, so now we get to get into the experiential part of it, right? Where I get to kind of delve into where academia meets, my actual lived experience and how it relates to grief specifically in those stages. And I know this, statement probably sounds kind of bold, but realizing queerness in a heteronormative world is a death. It is. Whether it's realizing there are certain things that society has told you makes up the perfect life that are now unattainable, or whether it's very, realistically watching your social support system fall away, watching professional networks fall away because you present who you are. I once heard someone, say they were like, we're in 2020. That's, being gay is not, that's not a concern anymore. And, I kind of have to just stare in awe. And I'm like, it's interesting how removed from reality certain people can be when they do not live within the experience. So starting off with denial, I existed as the faithful abomination. One of the things that I think is so complicated, especially as you're young and growing up queer and closeted, is that if you are in a religious, conservative environment, it is not unlikely that you are going to be told that being queer is an abomination, that you are sinful, that you are unnatural. You're going to get this long laundry list of these terrible things that you are. And as a child, you don't have lived world experience to counter that. All you know is that the authority figures around you, whether it be your family, whether it be your religious institutions, whether it be your academic institutions, all you know is that the institutions around you are supporting the same narrative. And now, of course, we're in 2021 where things are a little more progressive. So we talk about things like safe spaces. But when you grow up without that, the only thing you are provided is this idea of who you are from other people. If we are to consult Cooley's Looking Glass self, the idea that who we are is a composite of the projections of what people have told us we are, then we understand how, damaging that can be to grow up hearing these negative messages about who you are. So in my denial phase, I was just like, this can't be right. This can't be it. It just can't be, right? I'm a preacher's son. I am in the church faithfully, religiously. Like, people are looking to me to be the poster child of this Christian wholesomeness. Like this can't be, right? Or even the aspect of denial of, wanting a certain type of life and knowing what consequence comes with being who you are. There is amazing denial that comes along with that process and not wanting to let go of this life you've envisioned for yourself. Moving on to anger, y'all, family, I wanted the white picket fence. I did not want complications. I did not need that, okay? The wife with the dogs, with a nice house, meeting other couple, like that was gonna be fine with me, right? If I would have had choice in the matter, that would have been okay. And then it goes to bargaining. I know that my story is not unique when I say this, but I would pray endlessly to God for my queerness to be taken away. And it's so crazy now because living and embracing who you are and the fullness of it is such a beautiful place to be in that it's so hard to even imagine that you lived in a time where you looked at it like that. But I'll tell y'all, there were nights and nights upon nights that I would pray without ceasing that God will remove it, that, I'm doing my best to be faithful to you, God, right? Because going back to that denial, this is what the institutions around me have told me that I am. They told me, I'm sinful, right? Not Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, right? That rhetoric has been so ingrained that this is what I believe, like there is no alternative. And at this point, everything that I'm doing is to no avail. And I'm taking it as a personal fault because I'm trying, right? Like I'm praying, I'm doing everything, I'm abstaining, I'm not engaging in anything. So I'm doing my job. Like, God, just work with me. I'm trying to work with you, work with me. And one of the most interesting things I ever remember kind of praying for, and this is to in no way invalidate my bisexual brothers and sisters because your identity is completely valid. But I remember praying to God, if you can just make me bisexual, if you could just make me bisexual and let me find one woman with which I can be attracted to, and I can, start this happy life. And if I can just find that one. And looking back now, of course, it feels so ludicrous to really be trying to bargaining with God, on this matter. But at the time, it made sense to me. Moving on to depression, when I disclosed, when I tell you it felt like the greatest weight lifted off my shoulder, it feels like 85% of the depression I experienced was related to being non-disclosed. Now, mind you, I only said 85 because one thing I want us to remember is that if you are closeted, or non-disclosed is a better term, because I don't want to put the onus on us that, we have to feel compelled to tell everyone. But if you are non-disclosed, everything that you suffer from in terms of mental health doesn't automatically go away because you've disclosed, right? There are still other things that comprise that depression. But I felt, like I say, that 85%, a large bulk of that depression was attributed to not only being closeted, but feeling like I was alone in this world, feeling like there would be no space. I had already negotiated that I was never going to come out, that I was not going to have a life that was fulfilling, that I just wouldn't know love. And this is as a youngster, okay? This is elementary school, middle school, where I am making this covenant that I know that I will not be able to find fulfillment in a sham of a future relationship or marriage. So I will just be someone who never engages in a relationship and is just alone for the rest of my life. And this is as a child, right? Not even having a full context of what the world would have to offer. And finally, when you get to acceptance, one thing I always jokingly say is, when I came out that closet door, I knocked it off the hinges, okay? I wanted to make sure there was no way I could go back. One of my biggest things was when I disclosed, I wanted to make sure anybody and everybody could know. So that's from my best friend to the mailman, anybody on the street, anybody in my most up echelon of intimate friends, family, everyone. So for me, that was a very big thing that I wanted to know that if I was going to take this leap, because like I said, disclosure is an extremely political decision. I wanted to make sure that I was prepared and that I understood that there truly was no going back. Let's see a little freezing on the slide. There we go. Okay, so as we kind of talk about grief, and once again, we talked a little bit about this earlier in terms of Black queerness, and wherever there is grief, there has to be loss as well. So once again, just to reemphasize that point, some of the grief that we talk about is cultural grief. We talk about what that is to really understand within your Black kinship, like, am I really accounted for? When we talk about liberating our people, am I included in the agenda item? Is there space for me? Or are we really saying straight Black lives? Is that what we're saying? There's also familial grief. So in cultural grief, we think about this extended metaphoric family, but we also understand that familial grief exists as well, where if you do potentially grow up or have lived in a religious or conservative environment, it is not out of reason to assume that there might be disowning from family, that relationships might change. So even if there is a pseudo acceptance on the surface area, internally there is a lot going on where you know that the vibe is different, you know that the love is not the same, you know that the interaction is very stagnant and is very forced. And finally, opportunity grief. And this becomes very important, especially when we talk about being in a professional setting as this, and we talk about, academia, and we talk about what it means to be who you are out loud in a very visible way. And whether that's covert discrimination, again, like you just know that was a blatant attack, or sometimes there are opportunities you didn't even know you were supposed to get that the door closed for because of how visible you are. And some of those things are things that you'll never necessarily know, but that you ruminate on and that you go on to consider in your own reconciliation and quiet time. All right, so not to get too hairy into it, but as we talk about disclosure pros and cons and non-disclosure pros and cons, one of the objectives, of course, is that we want to know how disclosure and non-disclosure can produce trauma. Because once again, it's very easy to just make the assumption that if non-disclosure was this heavy burden, this heavy secret, that obviously, right, the simple fix is just tell people, right? It's just that simple, right? And everything will feel lighter. But we know from both experience and, from research and studies that that's just not the case, that it's always this smooth transition. So when we talk about disclosure pros, what are some of the good things about it? So I love our theme of naming ourselves for ourselves, right? So you have that sense of reclamation. You get to tell people who you are. You don't get to be boxed in. You get to let people know who you are and how you show up in this world. Also, there's open participation in community. There's that extension of social support. I remember before, disclosing, there were so many integral people along the way who, because they were simply living as themselves out loud, it gave me a pathway. When I was younger, it felt like there was no possibility that I would ever be disclosed. But to move and to see them and to get older and to understand the reality of that possibility, and to now to be able to be in community in a very open way with those same people who were my inspiration, who did allow me to feel that there was a path forward into a healthy, brighter future. That is one of the biggest pros that you get with disclosure. Now, with every good thing comes bad things too. So, what are some of the cons that you can face with disclosure? You're more susceptible to overt attack and discrimination, right? Sometimes it's hard to attack and discriminate against what you can't see, but when you show up as who you are, when you present unapologetically, it is easier for you to be targeted. Another thing, there is no undo button, okay? Then this goes back to my point of disclosure being a very political decision. Like, what happens when you make that decision, you tell people who you are, and like for me, you wake up the next morning and you kind of go, was that a dream? Did I? Oh, I did. Oh, yeah, things about to change, right? And everybody's not necessarily ready for that undo of that irreversibility. Everybody is not prepared for that. And you don't have to, feel bad about it if you're not ready for that. Because the conditions that, have been created that make you feel like, A, you should even have to disclose. And if you do disclose, that you're susceptible to danger. You are not the person that created those. You are, victim to what has already been created. So if disclosure is something that you don't want to do currently, or it's something that you feel you're just not ready to do yet, or you feel it's something you'll never be ready to do, that is entirely your personal decision. When it comes to our non-disclosure pros, so once again, going back to that idea of passability, it's way easier to pass when you're not disclosed. Well, depending on who you are, I always had a little extra glitter in my walk, as some people would say. So it was a little harder for me to pass, though I was told that in some settings, I was able to pass a little better. But in a heteronormative society, passing is power, passing is privilege. And we'll actually talk a little bit about that later, about power, privilege, and how to weaponize those. But that potential to pass is one of the greatest qualities of non-disclosure. And to that point, you get to retain some semblance of privacy. One of the things you'll notice, when you disclose, I wrote a poem once where I said, after disclosing, it felt like all eyes were like on me and in me, and like I couldn't reach them, like I couldn't close them. It was something that I couldn't get to, but I felt like I was exposed in a new way. And when you don't disclose, even if there is speculation, there is still that semblance of privacy that at least everybody doesn't know. Or even if people are speculating, they don't know for sure. They have their suspicions, but they don't know. And that also is power. Now, the cons of non-disclosure, there is a greater potential for internal conflict and lived dissonance. Now, what I personally enjoy, regardless of any of the hurdles that I face by being out, one thing I don't have to do is like have the mental gymnastics going on of how to keep the secret, right? Of who can I tell this person, but I can't tell this person. So I have to be careful about what I say in this setting because these people know, but these people don't know. So there's a lot of dissonance in this dual existence that occurs when you have to be somebody internally different than who you are externally. And finally, there's a lot of mental, emotional claustrophobia. As I was nearing my disclosure, it just felt like there was absolutely too much I had going on in my life for this secret to be something I could actively give energy to. I just felt at the time my world is like crashing down right now, and this is not something I can actively try to figure out how to combat. So that mental, emotional claustrophobia does have the potential to take you over. All right, so now we're going to talk about the compounding effect of interacting oppressive systems as it relates to our queer grief. And we want to look at it through a social systems theory analysis. So what social system theory essentially posits is that all of us are systems, and we're a part of greater systems, and we interact with these greater systems. And these systems have resources they need, they provide opportunities, and understanding our relationship with these systems allow us to understand how we operate within these spaces. So as we look at some of these systems, I'm actually going to start from the center, from one of the most important systems. You, all in and of yourself, count as a system. You are a system that is comprised of subsystems. If we want to go from a physiological approach, you have a body, which is your system, right? And we all know, even if we weren't paying attention to biology, we have a digestive system, a cardiovascular system, muscular system, skeletal system. All of these systems work to make sure that your body does what it needs to do. And in a very metaphoric extension way, all of these systems are interacting in that same way to hopefully get you what you need. In a more critical analysis way, also we're identifying where there are gaps in these systems. So you are a system, your family is a system, and in your family, you're a subsystem now. Your family, your friends, another area in which you're a subsystem. When we talk about the community system, you and your family are a subsystem of the greater. So you can see in a very inception, almost, what is it, the Russian dolls, when you take one off and take one off, and you see that within a system is another system, and we narrow it down to our smallest system, and we also go up to our greatest macro level systems. So when we're looking at who we are and how we are interacting with these institutions through a lens that is very critical and analytical of what Black queer grief is and how Black queer individuals operate within it, we have to ask, how are our systems interacting with us, and how are we interacting with our systems? So as we are at the core of these system relationships, we start to think about family and friends. I know one of the biggest things I had to consider within my disclosure was, what is social support going to look like, right? Even as we tag in religious institutions, I come from a deeply religious background, deeply conservative background. I don't know how many of us on the call are from Alabama, but if you're from Alabama, then you know Alabama. So you have an understanding of what that means. So as we exist in these spaces, having to make, once again, that political decision of disclosure, what do family and friends have in terms of power? What opportunities do religious institutions have to be discriminatory, to prevent, opportunities, and to, construct barriers to the access that we need? And further extending that to our governmental institutions, how are Black queer folk represented in legislation? How are we represented in policy? Are we protected? Are we prioritized? And I'm sure that's obviously the question of just about any marginalized group, is the question of protection and representation. Looking at the criminal justice system, how are we handled within that? Our employment system, our educational system. And what is so interesting about these systems as we interact is that we're not just interacting in these systems, but these are systems of authority. These are systems for which many of us have to defer because there is this power imbalance, when it comes to the criminal justice system. We don't, as much as we want to rally against it, we don't have the individual autonomy to just be like, oh, I'm not listening to you. This is what's written in law, so I'm just not going to do it, because we understand the repercussion for that. When it comes to your educational system, when it comes to instructors who are not only not affirming of queer identity, but that have their own internal bias. And even if you can't prove it on paper, they have their bias towards certain students, and there are certain students that will get treated differently. I remember, being in high school, and there was one individual who was out, and they were very visibly out. And, I had so much admiration for them. But obviously I was still, quiet. I was still closeted. But the one thing I could tell was that the interaction was so interesting between this individual and the teacher. And I could always see that there was a sense of annoyance and irritation at the flamboyance of this individual, at the extraness of this individual. And, I think to myself, whenever we get on Twitter, whenever we get on Facebook, whenever we get on any of these social sites, and we see individuals on these posts about queer identity, and you just see the nastiest, rudest, most disparaging comments, you have to take a step outside of yourself and think to yourself, these are community leaders. These are religious leaders. These are politicians and policymakers. These are officers of the criminal justice system. These are teachers, right? And just because they come into the classroom and we throw around words like cultural competence and cultural sensitivity, it doesn't mean that these people turn off their bias when they walk in the door, even if that's what you would be had to believe. So as we look at these systems, it's important because once again, going back to the it's not that deep crowd, well, if it's not that deep, why are we unpacking it on a systemic level where it's not me just fictionalizing my experience? These are actual things that can be tracked. These are actually institutions where I can say I am being treated differently. And because they have authority, because they exert power over my life and the decisions that I'm able to make, it isn't a simple decision of me just thinking it away, right? It requires action against these systems. It requires the rallying, it requires the protesting. It requires, in a lot of instances, deconstructing and rebuilding something entirely different. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about Holman's social exchange theory, because now we've talked a lot about Black queer grief in terms of what it looks like, in terms of how those losses not only exist, but even from a systemic vantage point, how it does operate, how a lot of it functions. And now we want to kind of talk about where we tap in together, where we talk about queer community, allyship, and where we come together. What do we actually do to ameliorate some of the concerns of the community? So in Holman's social exchange theory, what we understand, and which is appropriate for this whole economically themed presentation, humans conduct cost-benefit analysis of relationships when deciding to maintain or discard them. So right, that makes sense, right? It's extremely straightforward. If I don't feel like a relationship is serving me, specifically if I feel like a relationship is harming me, if I feel like it's destructive to me, I'm not going to want to maintain it. I'm going to want to discard it. I'm going to want to know how to flee. I'm going to want to know how to get out of it. And oftentimes, when it comes to bridging the gaps between allies and maybe the queer community and even non-allies, one of the biggest things that I think is conducted directionally in all ways is that we are doing a cost-benefit analysis. You know, do I feel like being an educator today to this group? Or to this person? Do I feel it's actually worth it? Do I feel like I'm talking to concrete when I am trying to express my lived experience, when I am providing theoretical framework? You know, is it for naught, so to speak? So these are the analysis that we do every single day with all of our relationships, where we're constantly reevaluating if it's worth sticking it out. So one of my favorite questions I've ever been asked is, what is community? And for me, I define community as safety and reciprocity. Because what I say is where there is not safety and reciprocity, for me, there is not community. And I think it's so important, once again, family. Hey, family, I'm tapping you in, family. I think it is so important that in these conversations, we hold each other accountable. Because for those who do have the privilege of straightness, right? How are you protecting other people who do not have that privilege, who are disadvantaged? Let's be realistic. Do you care? And I'll just let the silence fill us for a second. Do you care? And I want you to be realistic with that, right? Because I'm not asking you to answer in the chat if you really care, but in the same way that as a Black community, we are collectively very critical of white folk who really can't understand when we talk about, you know, police brutality issues, when we talk about Black social injustice. We understand that oftentimes there isn't a lack of understanding, there is a lack of relatability. There's a lack of you being able to see me as your brother, or you being able to see me as your son. So when we are critical of police brutality, then you have 1,000 excuses in the world because they never look like you, right? You have that ability to separate yourself. So when we're in the Black community, we can also hold each other accountable in saying, does the same thing happen intracommunally, where when it comes to queer rights, a lot of people get quiet, y'all. A lot of people they don't want to step up. They don't necessarily want to attend and learn more because they don't see themselves in the conversation. So you have to ask yourself, do you actually want to be in community? So safety is so important. I remember And, I'm a Twitter head. So there was at one time this Twitter debate where Black gay men were talking about our experiences in the barbershop. And for any Black man, we understand, just like I'm sure Black women understand, the kind of sanctity of the Black salon, and for us, the sanctity of the Black barbershop, and how for so many, it's like a reprieve. It's a place of oasis where, people can come and be themselves. And a lot of Black gay men were talking about it, and they were essentially saying, I'll be honest with you, I understand what the barbershop is supposed to be, but from my lived experience, that has not been it. When I go in and I hear some of the misogynistic conversation and hear some of the transphobic and homophobic conversation, I'm listening and I don't feel safe here. And if I know that I don't feel safe here, then I know you're not going to have my back. I know that reciprocity is not something that I'm even trying to engage with you. So 9 times out of 10 in our spaces where we should have community, we are settling for a simple self-protection because we can't expect it externally, but we are doing our best to self-preserve. So once again, in our conversation about accountability, what is that proximity to privilege? And this is one of my, favorite parts of this presentation, simply because I don't want us to get too lax or too comfortable that because we are marginalized in one aspect of our identity, that like keeps us safe and that there is no privilege that we are able to exercise. So some examples, right? So if you are a Black queer man, in terms of your race, you're racially oppressed. In terms of your sexuality, you're oppressed. But in terms of your gender, you're privileged. So as a Black gay man, in terms of my sexuality and race, there's discrimination that I face. But as a man, there's power that I have. When I am in men-dominated spaces and there are conversations with which women come up, if I hear disparaging comments, if I hear misogynistic comments, I am accountable. If I say I am in community with Black women, it is my responsibility to step up and to utilize my privilege. I remember in undergrad, there was like this meeting of men, right? Where men could come together in a safe space and discuss issues. And I remember there was one attendee and he started talking about, the women of today and how the women of today, in terms of their standards and their expectations, not aligning with their presentation, and how he had the goal of a wife, but, essentially that the women that he saw during this time don't give, wife energy. And of course, me being who I am, had to chop that all the way down. Number one, starting with the fact that you're not about to sit here and talk about women in an objectified way, like women are your property to just do with whatever you want to do, right? So in those conversations, whether it be formal like that, or whether it even be just everyday conversation with one of your friends and they say something, and you have privilege in that context, you're able to step up and say, no, that's not cool. Even in the instance of it being jokes, because a lot of times jokes are the, optimal time that a lot of that discriminatory language occurs. And when we don't challenge it, we are giving this complicit answer that it's okay. So if we look at a disabled queer woman, right? So she might be socioculturally oppressed, with her disability. In terms of her sexuality, she is oppressed. And in terms of her gender, she is oppressed. So with this one, it's almost like a trick, right? We have to know what are some other criterion, what is her socioeconomic status? Does she have access to wealth? That might be something that privileges her. Racially, is she in a racial majority? So these are questions that you can ask a white cis het woman. White, she's racially privileged. In terms of sexual orientation, she is sexually privileged, but in terms of her gender, she is oppressed. So understanding what that cis het power looks like, what her power in terms of her race looks like. Being able to break down any area that we have in terms of our power, in terms of our privilege, allows us to answer these next questions. How do we utilize what privilege we do have? Like I said, it doesn't have to be, these great instances of weaponizing your privilege where it always looks like presentation and panel and research project. It's not always that, expansive. Sometimes it simply is within a family conversation. If you are an ally and queer conversation comes up, and one of the biggest conversations you'll hear nowadays is, I don't have no problem with gay people, but why they gotta be everywhere? Why they gotta be in all the TV shows? Why they gotta be, there's always a gay character, there's always something in the news you're hearing. And you have the opportunity to say, well, do gay people like not exist everywhere? Like, do gay people just like get dropped off a boat? Like, did they just like exist? Did they just materialize, in Aphrodite form, just coming from the sea foam out of the ocean? Is that right? You have the opportunity to engage people and to challenge what they think they know about what they think they know. Also, how do we mobilize despite the privilege that we don't have? So a big part of that is, once again, holding our extended family accountable, seeing the people around you who do have privilege and questioning how they can operate in their privilege, what power they can extend. And also, let's just be realistic. We know already as Black folk what it is for us to collectively mobilize, for us to depend on each other, for us to be the community that we often have not had externally. But once again, it's hard to do that when there's intracommunal tension. Going to the next line, exploring intracommunal apathy, intracommunal denial, intracommunal harm. Because within the community, when there are individuals who will not vouch for you, who will not protect you, who will not open space for you and defend you, that leads directly to intracommunal harm. That's indirect intracommunal harm, not to even mention the direct intracommunal harm of, this is supposed to be my brother. You're supposed to be looking out for me. You're supposed to protect me. I'm supposed to protect you. And you are one of my biggest concerns. You are one of my biggest worries. You are one of the reasons why I have to be conscientious of what I wear when I walk into a space. You are one of the reasons I have to be conscientious about saying out loud who I am. So we have to be very critical. We have to, once again, have these uncomfortable conversations that are to say, hey, Black folk are excellent. Black power is excellent. Solidarity is excellent. But let's be for real and make sure that solidarity is really solidarity. Let's make sure community is actually community, because you're not doing enough if all you're doing is not discriminating, is not being prejudicial, is not directly attacking people. That's not enough to just sit and not do something. The real power lies in what you are doing. Are you meeting and collaborating and finding out ways to make space for other people who might look like you, but who might not lead the same lives that you lead? All right, so as we're kind of nearing the end of the presentation, one thing that I definitely always like to bring and submit into this argument is the conversation of like feelings and protection. When I come to you and we're having this conversation, one thing that I want us to definitely understand is that as much as feelings are important in this conversation, I don't want it to be lost on us that I'm really coming to you to talk about protection. It is great to have the warm, fuzzy feelings, kumbaya. I want to be in community with my people. I want y'all to love me as much as, I love you. But at the end of the day, the greater argument is about protection, because feelings are beautiful, and it's important that we all have that semblance of health in that capacity. But understand that, just like going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when we talk about physiological needs being first, making sure my people are safe are paramount. So I love if you listen to the presentation and you were moved in terms of sentimentality, but more important than that, I want you to know that there's a very real crisis that exists within the community, and that protection for me is always going to be paramount over the feelings. Yeah, I want you to feel the warm, fuzzy things, but I also want you to understand I'm not tapping you in just to make you feel happy. I'm tapping you in because your power makes all the difference in the way our community is protected. All right, so takeaways as we go ahead and wrap up. More is grief than we recognize. One of the most important things, like I said, in both my grief work, as it relates specifically to this topic, but in general grief work, sometimes people don't realize that if it's not physical death, it's not grief. So I would be remiss as a grief healing worker if I didn't say, hey, take your time to grieve. Grief doesn't always have to look like somebody physically passing away. To that point, disruptors to healthy grieving complicate, exacerbate, and extend grief. Once again, if you are one of those people who has ever said, oh, well, LGBTQIA plus issues, oh, that's their issue. It's not that deep. It doesn't affect me. I want you to take into account that there are people whose whole lives are altered, whose whole mental health is altered because of the negative experiences and interactions they have on a daily. And not only did they lose a semblance of a quote unquote normal life when they disclosed or simply realized who they were, but there were also very material losses that came along that complicate their ability to enter into integrated grief, where even though there are losses, there is still a healthy approach to life. Next to last, are you in community? If not, do you want to be? And that's another thing I really want us to be comfortable with. I feel as though a lot of people who don't quote unquote approve of your lifestyle, as if you can actually approve or deny, accept or reject, like anybody has that autonomy and power to reject or deny someone else. Are you in community? And if not, do you want to be? I feel as though we have to be very comfortable, or at least willing to have that conversation, that everybody you talk to is not willing to prioritize your protection. Some people don't care that you are not safe. And I think I can do so much more in terms of efficacy with you if you tell me up front who you are, than us having to kind of pretend and me thinking I'm getting through to you or that I have support in you. And that is nothing of the sort in terms of what you intend to provide. So do that internal reconciliation. It's not something you have to answer publicly, but do you want to be in community? If we're going off the definition of safety and reciprocity, are those things that you care about extending to Black queer individuals in your life, in your space? Or is that something that you truly don't care about? And if you don't care about it, go even deeper internally and ask yourself why you don't. Is it truly because there's the separation there? It's not you, it's not me, it's not my problem, so I don't have to worry about it. Finally, what that privilege do, right? So most of us on this call are probably marginalized. That's true. But even in your marginalization, you do have some sense of power, some sense of privilege. So don't sleep on that. Don't sleep on the opportunity to be good. One thing I often say, especially as it relates to us being in this professional setting, is so many amazing, dynamic people out here doing incredible work, and you're great. You are great. That resume is packed. Your accomplishments are just noteworthy. It's okay to be great, but make sure that we're also being good. It's not enough to just, be this person on paper. Make sure that you are actually looking at your privilege. You are looking at your power and your ability to help change the world for positive, and really hold yourself accountable as we're holding our extended family accountable, and making sure that we are mobilizing and that we are weaponizing our privilege to protect our people. So with that said, checking my phone, it definitely is 12:33, so I don't know how much time we have for questions, but I want to thank you, Nadia and Martyrs, so much for the opportunity to share space with you all. It's been such a privilege, and I do hope that something was said that, a little nugget that you can take on into your life's journey, and hopefully provide the space that we need to provide for the most marginalized of us. So thank you.
Thank you, Josh. We did not have any questions. I think we're all just soaking everything in. So thank you so much for all that great information. We truly appreciate the work that you're doing and your transparency during this whole presentation. What great work are you doing? And so thank you so much for that, and just sharing and giving us so much knowledge and so much education. I'm still chewing on it. So thank you so much. I made a statement earlier. I root for everything Black, but everything Black is not rooting for me.
Hello.
And that's a deep statement
it
to
really
have.
is.
So just know that we are definitely rooting for you, and we are here to continue to support you on this journey and this advocacy. And we thank you so much for being bold, being brave, and being out.
Absolutely.
And thank you so much for being the unicorn that you are. So thank you so much. transparency goes a long way in this field, and it definitely goes a long way when presenting. So we appreciate you, and we're so grateful for all that you do in all the spaces that you occupy. So thank you so much. So I'm gonna ask Dr. Nadia Richardson to come and join me as we close out. Thank you again, Josh.
Absolutely, so welcome.
As we close out for today. So Dr. Richardson, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you so much, Josh. That was top notch. I really appreciate you. All of these sessions are going to be recorded, so you will have a recording of that as well as all of our participants. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. So welcome. So glad to be here.
Okay, well, we are